I am Dr. Tabunda from the Development Academy of the Philippines. 2 points. First, I think the PCAD meaning is an oxymoron. Imagine absolute democracy with the monarch as the head of the state. My main point is, what do you think would happen to Thailand post Bumibol? And I was the last time I was in Bangkok, this was 2010, and we were warned by our hosts from, I think that was Chulalongkorn University, to refrain from issuing, some statements. But now, it's the first time I'm going to say this, and this question: is the king really the moderating influence, or is he the chief backer of the royalists? Thank you.
Morning, sir. Thank you for that interesting lecture. I'm Celine Socrates. I'm a teaching associate at the Political Science Department. My question is, how can we use political culture to understand the political situation in Thailand? Is it possible that certain values espoused in certain societies are naturally incompatible with the values of democracy?
Hi, I'm Carol Hernandez. I'm sorry for being late, but my question is related to the first one. There are opinions that circulate I just came from Bangkok a few days ago, and some of the guys that I spoke with said something about Priyut undertaking the coup because he did not like the crown prince. So can you comment on that?
Okay. So we have two interesting questions about the monarchy as Thailand's traditional institution, and one question on linking political culture and democracy. Sure.
Yeah, the monarchy gets a lot of attention now. There's in fact a whole industry of people who have promoted the idea that almost all of the events that have taken place in Thailand over the last decade have something to do with succession. I'm not sure I buy it. However, discussing the monarchy, as a couple of you said, is difficult in Thailand because there are laws which can send you to jail for 12 to 15 years for insulting the monarchy. There's a very strange story from just a couple of days ago where a woman who was opposed to the coup stood outside the US Embassy with a sign which said, "Long live the USA." She was arrested and accused of insulting the monarchy because normally those terms were used, "Long live the king," and she had changed king to USA. She's been released since then, but you get an idea of how tricky in Thailand discussing the monarchy is. Now, I don't go to Thailand anymore, so I can discuss the monarchy. Is there anyone here from the embassy? I was going to ask if I really am on a blacklist. The notion that the oxymoronic term of, is that the word, oxymoronic? Or maybe just moronic, I'm not sure. Of the name of the absolute democracy is a throwback to the notion of an absolute king, right? So that's what they're drawing on. And in Thai, it's easy to see those connections, and people make those connections. So they know what they're supporting. So while it might be an oxymoron, it's referring to this movement, like the PAD before it, as seeing itself and projecting itself as protecting the king. Now, the king hasn't been the moderating influence as portrayed in much of the literature. You know, the first real critical view of the king and his reign was Paul Handley's book, The King Never Smiles, which is banned in Thailand. But just about everyone you come across has read it because it circulates on the internet. And in fact, one American citizen who was a Thai originally went back to visit Thailand, and he was thrown in jail for a couple of years for allegedly translating parts of that book into Thai. But there are certainly plenty of Thai versions around. Most kings are conservative. So it's no surprise that the Thai king would have conservative values. He has been a moderating influence in some situations, for example, when in 1992 people were being shot on the street by the military and the police, and they were demonstrating against another military intervention in politics, not by a coup, but by the leader of a previous coup who said he would never become Prime Minister, suddenly becoming Prime Minister. So there was a reaction against that. And the King came out and called the leaders of both sides together and organised some sort of transition. Now that may be called moderating, but already dozens of people have been killed and several hundred injured by the time that he did that. There have been other occasions where the palace and people, and when we're talking about the King, we need to talk about a larger group around the King, the Privy Council, who are his advisors selected by him, and other people inside the palace network. At other times they've been destructive of moderation. For example, in 1975 and 76, the monarchy moved very strongly to support very right-wing and hyper-nationalist groups responding to an electoral system at that time which was seen to be dangerously left-wing. At the time, of course, the Vietnam War was coming to an end, communists were taking over in Laos, the King had been thrown out in Laos, Cambodia, there had been a change of regime. So the King got very scared and he actively supported right-wing groups that eventually massacred perhaps hundreds of students at Thammasat University. So you need to read the whole history of what the King has been doing, but he is conservative and he has generally supported military regimes. In the last coup, the King was not seen meeting the junta on the night of the coup to anoint them. They learned from 2000, that's what they did in 2006. They learned from 2006. They got bad publicity. People started to talk about the monarchy in a political way. Look, they supported the coup. Not only did they support the coup, people associated with the palace were involved in planning the 2006 coup. Sitting down with conspirators and planning a coup against the elected government. In 2014, the military did not want anyone to see that. So when the King gave his approval to the coup, it was done by a letter carried by a palace official and read by a palace official on television. Right? But the King has not appeared. Now the King is also sick, and he's been sick for many years. The Queen has had a stroke and she's not been seen for over a year. So there is a change coming. And this gets to your question of the Prince. No one in Thailand likes the Prince very much. But he's been around for a long time. He's been a bully, he's been a womanizer, he's got lots of girlfriends and wives, and he says, oh, well, I'm just like the kings of the past, right? You know, Chulalongkorn had 86 wives or something like that. And he spends a lot of his time overseas. In fact, he left Thailand just before the coup, about a week before the coup, and he spends most of his time in Munich, where he has a girlfriend, he's got lots of cars, he flies his own 737 over there, or sits in it while it goes over there. And he's seen as being not like his father. But then no one is going to have the prestige that has attributed to his father over 50 or 60 years of a reign where there has been non-stop propaganda for him as the monarch. It's kind of like North Korea with advertising in Thailand when it comes to the King. So things will change when succession comes, when the King dies. The King has never changed his decision that he made in the early 1970s that the Prince would succeed him. He's never changed that decision. Thais, particularly those who supported the people's, the recent demonstrations, want the crown, or the person who's called the Crown Princess. Crown is a strange name to use with a princess. And they claim that the Constitution allowed the princess to become queen rather than the prince. And that's what they hope for because they like her because she's a jolly lady, a bit plump like me, who laughs a lot and is nice to people compared to the prince. And she's had lots of good publicity. However, she's not married and she doesn't have, therefore, what do you call it in proper royal terms, an issue. She doesn't have children. So what do you do then after that? So that doesn't necessarily solve the problem for the royal family. And the next person in line is the prince's youngest son, who's only sort of that height. He's about 6 years old. So that the monarchy has a problem itself. And all this discussion of succession has actually politicised succession as it wasn't politicised before. What happens though, I don't know. In the 2006 coup, there were analysts who came out and said the military wants to be in charge when there's succession. They don't want Thaksin being in charge at succession. They claim he has a relationship with the prince. That was in 2006. The same thing has been said about 2014. The king's mother lived until she was 97. So he might still go on for a long time. Who knows? But it's all rumour and speculation. So there's not a lot you can say about the monarchy.
Thank you. Yes, Professor Lim.
Perhaps we need to have some explanation of why Thaksin is able to get massive support from rural peasants, farmers, and what they call the red buffaloes against the middle classes. Because that is why there is now a massive polarization of classes. And therefore, is there a class war in Thailand? And also, the Communist Party of Thailand used to be quite strong with very massive support from young students, especially from Thammasat University and from the sector of the Buddhist Sangha. And it's the Communist Party of Thailand who was against the Vietnam War, and that kind of thinking also is very important, I think, in terms of how they look upon the military.
Ed Tadel from the Asian Center. First of all, I'm responsible for organizing this talk, and I'd like to apologize to the massive crowd that has come in. We usually don't get this much spectators. I suppose we owe it all to Kevin's charisma, his name. But, so sorry for the inconvenience to everyone. Anyway, Kevin, my question basically has to do with one of my favorite topics, and that is the left. What has happened to the Thailand? We all know, of course, that the Communist Party Thailand was just dismantled voluntarily, I hear, in the 1970s. But there have been remnants that have been going around the country, making a little noise now and then, and can also be found in areas where Thaksin is quite strong in the northeast, but also among the academics in Chulalongkorn and Thammasat. So basically my question is, whither the left?
Well, for a while we were rooting for the anti-corruption, the Thaksin, all that stuff. But we tried to research further. Now with the recent developments also, I'm Mike Luna, no? I used to be from this university anyway, long time ago, many black years ago. Now it seems that there's now a mockery and a dysfunctional or a sophistry or dysfunctional definition of democracy. Even recently, even the military coup even redefines their role to that they're protecting democracy, and all that stuff. So, but when I try to I want to pursue the old ladies Madam's concern that what created the support for Thaksin, and I tried to did some research, and there were some development programs that Thaksin initiated, like the high-speed railways, credit for development programs, the rural poor, scholarship for the rural poor, a lot of stuff, even the Canal bordering Malaysia and all that stuff. And all these programs were rejected by Avisit Vidya Diva, whose deputy is now Sutep, who was one of those instrumental in the massacre demonstrations of the red shirts right after the no, and then yeah. So I'm just wondering how this would. A few comments.
Again, big questions. Let me take Thaksin and his support first and where it comes from. If you go back to Thaksin only formed his, sorry, I'm going to have to go through this. If you go back to when Thaksin was elected in early 2001, and the campaign was in late 2000, his party was only formed in 1998 in the depths of the Asian economic crisis, and it was formed as a party of capitalists. His first cabinet could have been taken straight out of the Communist Manifesto. It was the Executive Committee for Managing the Whole Affairs of what remained of the bourgeoisie in Thailand. His idea was to rescue the capitalist class. But to do that, under the 1997 Constitution, he and his supporters realised they had to win an election. That's what had changed. And Thaksin, being a businessman, decided that, well, if we're going to save the capitalist class, we have to have something that will get us elected, so we're going to have a program. Now, no political party in Thailand had ever really come up with a platform that they then, or a program that they then implemented after they'd been elected. And Thaksin, the businessman, organised focus groups, he organised American-style surveys in which he found out what people wanted and what was important to people. He connected to grassroots NGO leaders and so on and found out what they thought would be good for the population. And it was kind of a new social contract. You elect us to save what remains of the capitalist class of Thailand, and we'll give you these things. We'll do these things for you. But almost all of the policies that he introduced, and I think this is important, were universalist, or essentially universalist. So even when he had a small loan scheme, one of the main 5 policies that he had was a small loan scheme for farmers, he also had loan schemes for business people and a bad debtors bank and that sort of thing to rescue the economy. Perhaps the most important decision that he made was to introduce a universal healthcare scheme, which was called the 30 baht system, because if you went to hospital, you had to pay 30 baht. Right? If you had medical treatment, you paid 30 baht, which at the time was about 75 cents or something like that.
40 pesos.
Back then, remember that the baht had gone way down, yeah, so it was very cheap. That is probably the most popular thing that Thaksin has done. And there's been lots of independent assessments of that, including by MIT and Harvard Public Health and those sorts of things, who have shown that it's had a major impact on reducing infant mortality and a whole range of other things. When the military came in 2006, they couldn't get rid of that program. It was so popular. What they did was said, you don't even have to pay 30 baht, we'll make it free. Now, however, the military is considering getting rid of it because they see it as part of the Thaksin regime and part of the attraction of Thaksin. But going back to why Thaksin is popular. Thaksin had all these programs, people voted for him. I observed the election in some parts of the northeast and people were saying, well, we tried the poor Chinese guy and that was Chun Likpai and he was pretty hopeless, so we might as well try the rich Chinese guy and see what happens. And Thaksin came in and delivered. And he hadn't made promises of, if you elect me, we'll build a road through your village or we'll build a pond. It was, we'll give you 30 baht healthcare, we'll give you loans. He said to people, we can all be, you don't have to be poor, we can all be rich together. Well, maybe not, but the idea was quite different to notions of charity that had existed before, or which the king espoused. The king espoused programs of charity. If it's cold, we'll hand out blankets to you, that kind of stuff. So it was a different program and people took it up and they really liked it. And that's what accounts in part for that attraction to Thaksin. Not only did he promise us stuff, but he did things. The other thing that happened under the 1997 constitution was there was quite a lot of decentralisation, and Thaksin couldn't do anything to stop that or to control it too much because it was done through constitutional procedures. But it was directing money to the local area on a government to people basis. It wasn't going through intermediaries, particularly say NGOs. And that's where you start to see NGOs pulling away from Thaksin as well, because they're being cut out of the equation. So Thaksin delivered. But that decentralisation delivered elections at all kinds of local levels. And people started to see that elections were making a difference locally. When I was trudging around villages in the 1980s in northeastern Thailand, there were almost no services in local areas. Electricity, roads, those sorts of things, yeah, but nothing else. You go around there now and there's waste disposal, there's rubbish trucks, trash trucks that come around and collect trash, there's all kinds of things that have been done at local level. So people started to think, we can have an impact on our politicians by how we vote. And that's the other thing that that Thaksin is credited with doing, even though it wasn't his real doing. It was through the 1997 constitution, but that also made him very popular. Here's a politician who promises things and gets them done. So people found a voice, a political voice that they hadn't had before. I didn't talk about political culture before, so remind me to come back to that one. The left. Like everything else in Thailand, the left is split. What's left of the left? The CPT is gone, of course, and I think almost the whole of the Politburo of the last version of the CPT appeared on the PAD stage at one time. Right, so they were supporting, somehow they became monarchists and royalists. But there has been a split. And if you go to parts of the northeast, for example, I don't know whether the, I'm going to blank out on the name of it, the sort of, the groups that were opposing dams in the northeast, what was the name of that group? Do you remember? Assembly of the Poor. Assembly of the Poor, yeah. The Assembly of the Poor initially was opposed to Thaksin and supported the PAD in 2005, but quickly moved to being more, maybe not 100% on the red shirt side, but saw that their constituency were red shirts, so they had to move in that direction. Really, the left is having not much impact on the things that are happening. There are some people who identify themselves on the left in places like Chiang Mai and in the northeast in Khon Kaen and Mahasarakam who have tried to organise people. But really, this has been a broad political movement associated with the Thaksin organising machine with his parties. So again, people on the left have sort of been cut out as well. So you end up with someone like Jai Ungpagorn, right, who's not in the country, he's in exile, is some strange Trotskyist version of a leftist. But he supports red shirts, but doesn't support Thaksin. And there is some element of that which has taken hold, and which some people see as potentially important for the future direction of Thailand's politics. However, what the military has done, particularly in rural areas, has been to cut out the leadership of the red shirts, and many of those people were local level leaders themselves. It wasn't as though they became red shirts and then became local leaders, they were local leaders before. So they've been neutralised by the military. So I'm not sure what that says about what's going to happen in the future. Is it a class war in Thailand? It depends on what you mean by class war. I've written some other papers where I've argued about the real differences between those parts. For example, let me give you an example. The South has been strongly supportive of the Democrat Party and anti-Thaksin. But when you look at the gross provincial product, the incomes, per capita incomes in those areas, they're much, much higher than, say, in the northeast and the north. Whether you can then go from that sort of income stuff and say, okay, this is a class war, I think is a big jump. But certainly class is playing a part in these things. And as I said, in the 2007 election, I think, it was the provinces that voted for Thaksin had a per capita GDP, I think it was GDP, or gross provincial product, that was about a half to 2/3 of those places that voted for the Democrat Party. So there's something going on there, right? But there are, as I said, the middle class in the northeast and the north, they voted for Thaksin. Well, the whole country voted for Thaksin, including most of Bangkok in 2005. Yeah. Political culture, I didn't answer that one. Are there different values on how you define democracy? Well, the yellow shirts and the royalists claim there are. They want Thai-style democracy, which is built on Thai values. The trouble is, values are debated. Political culture is not something that descends from heaven to anoint everything that happens in the country. Political culture is constructed, and it's constructed politically. And what the military is engaged in at the moment is a reconstruction, trying to draw people away from political values of voice and participation and to reassert hierarchy and so on.
Good morning. My name is Chito Gascon. I teach part-time politics in De La Salle University and also in government right now. First, I'd like to thank you for a very interesting and very comprehensive view of Thai politics today. And what I'm grappling with is sort of like, aside from the description of what are the prospects moving forward? Are there efforts, for example, to try and build consensus on how to bring Thai politics from the brink towards some form of the beginnings of genuine democracy? Or are we seeing over the long term continuation of the conflict that may result in major cleavages? Is Thailand going to divide between North and Northeast and South, Bangkok in the south, things like that? So is there efforts, whether in the opposition, the yellow or the red or the military or the royalists, to try and bring a consensus towards democracy? Then my second question related to prospects is what of the south, in particular the Muslim south? Is that going to be part of the equation at all?
Are there other questions? Can I ask a question? Okay. You've talked about the anti-democratic discourse of SUTEP and the PDRC, the People's Democratic Reform Committee, but because I also studied the rise of Thaksin, can you also make comments about Thaksin's own anti-democratic discourse? Whether it's really not more on majoritarian democracy, but his idea about liberalism, his idea about the role of accountability, because he has been quoted as saying as democracy is only a means to a further end and is not an end in itself. But we all know as Democrats that they are both. It's not, we value democracy not just for consequences, but also because it's good to pursue a democratic path regardless of the outcome.
Yeah, good questions. Let me take the last one first and then move to prospects. Thaksin and democracy. One of his supporters did a talk once at the Foreign Correspondents Club of Thailand. A guy named Chakrapop, who's now lives in exile because in that speech was considered lèse-majesty, so he's lived in exile since that time. And he made an observation that Thaksin's smart, Thaksin's a businessman, but he didn't necessarily understand what he was engaged in. I'm trying to think of the exact terms he said. He said that Thaksin sleepwalked into history. And I think there's something in that. Thaksin came into power as an elected politician, as I said before, to save the capitalist class that remained in Thailand. But by unleashing forces at the local level, through notions of voice, voting, programs being delivered that supported the poor and the not so poor in those areas, made a difference that Thaksin wasn't necessarily aware that it wasn't what he planned to do. So Thaksin, when he was in power in the period from about 2001 through until, say, after the 2005 elections, particularly after the 2005 elections, displayed arrogance. The quote that you gave about democracy as a means, not an end, was made about the same time that he said that the model that he saw for Thailand, and this is where he had this arrogance from this landslide victory that he had, was the Singapore model or the Mahathir Malaysia model. That is, that he would stay in power for 20 years. Whether that was by election or not wasn't stated, but the idea was my interpretation of the idea was that we've become the natural party of government and people will keep us in power for 20 years because we are delivering. Now, that arrogance also set off a lot of the opposition to him. If he didn't want to talk to the press, he just told them to shut up. If people said things that he didn't like, he had, like Lee Kuan Yew, he used legal suits against them to try and shut them up. So he was no particular Democrat. But I think the changes that have taken place in Thailand in recent years, again, see Thaksin sleepwalking. He's been very quiet since the coup. It's his 65th birthday coming up shortly, and he's going to celebrate that in Paris, and he may be celebrating it in a very lonely way because even his family members are unlikely to be allowed out of Thailand to visit him, or if they are, they might worry that their passport will be removed and they can't come back. But the red shirt, if we look at the red shirt movement, there was much more of a democratic process taking place in the red shirt movement. Okay, they also had problems and structures that weren't necessarily elected and so on. But the red shirt movement was often pulling against Thaksin and his party. For example, you mentioned the amnesty bill at the start. Many red shirts opposed the amnesty bill. They came out against the amnesty bill because they didn't want to see people who had engaged in criminal actions and murder get away with that. They weren't particularly worried about Thaksin, but they were really more concerned about that because it was a blanket amnesty. So they were opposed to that kind of thing. And people saw some hopes for a broader grassroots democratization through those kinds of movements. Thaksin also was not a populist when he came into power, but he became a populist. If you go back and look at YouTube videos of his first election, if they're available, he would often wear a suit and a tie, and he would throw a lot of English into his campaign speeches. By 2005, he's out in villages doing live TV shows from villages, almost like, what did I go past last night? Big Brother or something. A house up here. It's that kind of stuff. He's living in a village, he's hearing what the villagers have to say and getting their opinions. He's open neck shirts, riding motorcycles. He's using local dialects when he's doing speeches and so on. This is Thaksin who became a populist. Right, so Thaksin has kind of been chameleon-like. So he's been democratic, he's been anti-democratic, but he's drawn along by history. He's not necessarily the person making the history. Prospects. I've been studying Thailand since I did my honours degree on Thailand in 1978. And I'm more discouraged by events in Thailand now than probably any other time since then. Reconciliation has been a term that's been used a lot. but that term has become politicised. It was used by the Democrat Party. It was used by some inquiries set up by the Democrat Party into the events of 2010 and so on. What's more likely to be the process at the moment is the military is enforcing consensus. There's been, it hasn't got that much attention in the media, but you can't, I'm going to make some kind of silly statements here, but this is the level of things that are being done. You can't stand on the side of the road and give away free sandwiches in Thailand, because sandwiches became a symbol of being anti-coup. Because people were going around doing that, right? You younger people understand this from the Hunger Games, right? People started doing that after the coup to oppose the coup. Now you weren't allowed to do that, so they started giving away sandwiches that you could hold that way, right? So you can't give out sandwiches. Then people started reading the novel 1984, sitting around malls. They were arrested. Right, so the level of repression of symbolism against the coup is down to that really silly level, right? And these are many of the people who are protesting are anti-coup, but not necessarily pro-red shirt. University lecturers are being told what they can and what they can't say in their classes, particularly in politics departments. School teachers are being told that they have to say certain things about the military. The military has also decided that they're changing the curriculum for the whole country. Something which is really difficult to do in Thailand, change the curriculum. But the 12 guiding principles of the military junta are going to be enshrined in the constitution. I could go on and on about these sorts of things. There have been over 500 people called in by the military to receive an interrogation, which often involves up to 12 military and other officials sitting around asking them about their Facebook accounts, their line, what do you do online, you text online or something, all of these kinds of things, and searching through them and trying to find things that show that they're anti-coup or anti-monarchy. That's over 500 that we know about. In the countryside, we don't know how many people have been called in or taken away. Someone I was talking to who was out in villages in the northeast recently said that within minutes of the coup taking place, fully armed soldiers in Humvees wearing balaclavas arrived in the village. That there are military checkpoints set up all around the northeast and the north to try and grab people, but also, and then stories of people just disappearing. So we don't know how much of that has taken place. But the military seems of the view that if you get rid of enough opponents, or if you can re-educate them, and they've used that term, re-education, you will get consensus. And out of that consensus, you will get some kind of reconciliation. My fear is that that won't happen, and that what you're getting is a whole bunch of people who are now effectively leaderless, but who aren't necessarily going to accept for the long term what's being done at the moment. And they will wait for some kind of opportunity. The opponents of Thaksin and Yingluck did that. They waited for an opportunity, which was the amnesty bill, to mobilise people. They will wait for that same kind of opportunity. But this is a much tougher military regime than we've seen in the past. At least since, we're probably going back to the mid-1970s for this kind of, this total control over the whole of society. The South, I don't really know a lot about the South, but the one official that Yingluck transferred, and that the Constitutional Court said, you can't transfer this guy, that's unconstitutional, you lose your job, just before the coup, he's now been put in charge of, he was national security leader. No, he was the leader, he was the head of the National Security Council. He's been put in charge of the events in the South, of trying to negotiate some sort of reconciliation in the South. The military, over the years, hasn't got a good record of being able to deal with the events in the South. and it's been a very up and down peace process. There have been talks taking place, but I really don't know what's happening with that at the moment. But if this guy is in charge, the people on the other side have to get used to another negotiator and another government in Bangkok. But during all of the political demonstrations, the focus on the South completely disappeared nationally, but the insurgency and the deaths, which are now over 5,000, continued. Over 5,000 since 2001 have continued.
A Thai friend of mine told me that the students who were reading books at, I think it was at Siam Paragon, one of the books they were reading too was Noli Me Tangere.
Is that
So,
right?
yeah.
Oh.
So that novel by Jose Rizal. And when I was wrapping up my fieldwork last year in Bangkok, on a Sunday, they also used those of us who read comic books, and though it turned into a movie, V for Vendetta, they were wearing V's masks.
Both sides have used that mark.
Yeah, because they keep on, they use that quote a lot, like the government should not, it's the government who should be afraid of its people, not the other way around. Maybe we can do one more round. I see Professor Miranda, Professor Nemenso would be next.
I think, good morning to all of you, and more so to the speaker. Thank you so much for your lecture. I think there's a very good reason for why this is a standing room only kind of affair now. That has not happened here very frequently. As a matter of fact, I don't remember it happening at all. Not in this room. I think the main reason for that is that so many of the people who are here are really struck by how similar in so many ways the political developments in Thailand had gotten to be in the past 2 years to those that we have had here, and which developments, I probably should use just the term happenings, because I don't think we are developing here. Those happenings have lasted so much longer than the events that you have been describing in Thailand. I was about to ask you earlier about, well, what kind of possibilities you might have in store for the Thai people so that you could have not quite reconciliation. We have had an extensive experience of that here. Not quite political modernization or democratization, but simply getting able to survive. I think the Thai Constitution, 1997 as well as 2006, say it in the very first sentence. One Filipino columnist wrote an entire book on that. Actually, these are his columns put together and titled Power Without Virtue. It could as well have been titled Virtue Without Power. In the Thai constitutions, the first sentence is, may there be virtue. Those of you who still remember your Philippine constitution, may realize that we are a lot more wordy than Thais. We specify all the virtues in our preamble. May there be virtue. Is it possible really for a nation such as Thailand to still somehow locate that virtue within their politics, such that perhaps 15, 20 years from now, we are all able to learn from their experience? The last thing I want to add as regards the discussions here has to do with theoretical frames. I understand that you much prefer modernization as a catch-all theoretical frame in comparative political analysis. I share that same, you might say, bias. Many times I think that we make a mistake. We make things more difficult when we try to force into yet other analytical frames those developments or happenings that do not really properly belong to them. I think basically people are looking at the Thai experience as well as the Philippine experience from the prism of democratization. I don't think this is a very productive way of looking at our politics. I think it is much better to speak of modernization and perhaps even context it within specific political cultures. That is how I think you'll be able to understand the national politics of this country as well as the national politics of countries like Thailand and others that are better situated, at least for the moment. So I end by making 3 suggestions. One, that we have more events like this, perhaps in a bigger room. Second, I suggest really that we put appropriate analytical focus on that which we must understand by the idea, the concept of virtue. This is not simple moralizing. There is a practical, operational content that must be situated in this term. And we have not done enough work on it, either as ordinary citizens or as academics, or as religious people for that matter. And the third thing, as I said, is take a look at the theoretical frame you use. If you are looking at a square peg, it will be criminal to insist on using a round hole, or the other way around. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor
Oh,
Miranda.
by the way, I would request strongly our speaker for the day to possibly pay a little bit attention to theoretical works happening within the same region. In this country, we finished one 2 years ago on democratization in the Philippines and assessment. And we spoke of it as chasing the wind. For those who are not familiar with the phrase, this is taken from Ecclesiastes. And when you chase the wind, that democratic wind in this country, you wind up windless, and the wind that comes from you, if anything remains, is exited from the wrong exit.
Thank you, Professor Miranda. Professor Nimenso, please.
Yeah, since the audience here consists of young people, I have to introduce myself. My name is Francisco Nimenso. 30 years ago, I was a colleague of Kevin Hewison at the Australian National University. Well, I'm sorry if I have to digress a little bit from politics, because lately I have been involved in this, in crafting a universal health plan for the Philippines. And we expect that this will be the next struggle after we won the RH bill, the reproductive health bill. I think this will be the last and next, and we are going to face a more formidable opposition from the Philippine Medical Association than the Catholic Bishops' Conference. Now, I think Thaksin had one of the most, at least as far as I know, the most successful attempt to implement a universal health law, a universal health care system. And can you tell us more about that? And I want to know how he was able to handle the doctors. Because almost everywhere, the medical association is the most powerful and the craftiest pressure group in the country, capable of blocking reform, the medical reform system like this, or else diluting it until it's no longer recognizable.
Thank you, Professor Menso.
Your last statement provides a very grim picture that there may not be compromises among the conflicting interests in Thailand. I was wondering because after the Vietnam War, there were many efforts within Thai society to reconcile various factions. Those factions who supported the government of Thailand in supporting the Vietnam War, and those who were in opposition. And then later on, they had a long period of some kind of self-introspection in order to recognize the contributions of the Thai left towards changing the political view. And there were even dialogues because I lived in Thailand for 2 years, but it was in archaeology, not in politics. Anyway, there were moves all over in many parts of the country to reconcile those conflicting views. Has this evaporated? And the other one, there are other development that is happening when they could not move within the political arena within Thailand. There is now a move to, let's say, regionalize issues. For example, like Thaksin organized farm cooperatives. This is very successful. That's why they talk about the poor rural peasant as red buffalo, because what he did was to provide buffaloes to the farmers, and this became their tractor. They could not mechanize, but they could provide beasts of burden. He provided also poultry. In the case of fisheries, that's what he did. In other words, there were productive cooperatives that they do. And this is not only in Thailand. They're working with their neighbors. And regardless of politics, they were working. In other words, there are existing programs not focused on politics, but in productive forces and in improving the livelihood, especially women's groups. The women are very, very active in, I think, in contributing to peace by providing, this is true, I've observed it in Northeast Thailand, and there the women work together to provide livelihood to the northeastern tribes, who were very marginalized. And so there are some efforts, I think, not necessarily the political side, but in terms of livelihood improvement.
Well, thank you very much for those questions from 3 distinguished professors. Can we locate virtue in Thai politics? And what would Thai politics be able to tell us in 15 or so years? If we go back 15 or so years, Thailand was the model in some ways for Southeast Asia. If you had been standing in Southeast Asia in 1996 or 7 and you had to choose the country most likely to make some kind of democratic transition, you wouldn't have you would have picked Thailand, and you probably wouldn't have picked Indonesia. And yet the Indonesian foreign minister made a reasonably strong comment on the coup after it happened recently. So I'm not sure what I can say about what it's going to look like in 15 years' time, because I would certainly be wrong, I think. There are many virtues in Thai politics, and there are many people who claim virtues. One of the arguments that I had in my paper, one of the points I made in the paper, was that there's a strong discourse in Thai politics that elected politicians are self-interested and have no virtues, no morals, and that the moralism lies within the monarchy and, oddly, to a lesser extent, within the Buddhist Sangha. Interestingly, one of the things that the military junta has done since it's been in power, since May, is to establish a kind of a police force and an online reporting system to allow people to report bad monks who are doing all kinds of bad things, gambling on the World Cup, having sex with women and children, and all kinds of other things. You can report them. So there's a clean-up which is going on of the Sangha, the Buddhist order. This is strangely reminiscent of something that happened during Sarit's period in the 1950s and 60s, late 1950s, when his coup took place. He completely reorganised the Buddhist order in Thailand to make it hierarchical and to make sure that there was control all the way down to the village level. Virtue is also defined in many ways. The king is defined as virtuous, mainly because he's the king. And he's done many good deeds in his life. He gets given lots of money, which he then gives away to other people, and he multiplies the merit that comes from that. He's also become one of the richest, or the monarchy has become one of the richest institutions in the world. It's worth about $40 billion. It's run by, the Crown Property Bureau is run by the same people who used to run the Sultan of Brunei's business interests. Sorting out the problems with, I think it was it Prince Jeffrey in those days? They moved from Brunei to Thailand. How much virtue comes from having large amounts of that much wealth, I'm not sure. In other words, I'm avoiding your question. But, you know, morality is a contested term that is fought over in Thailand. Thaksin was considered moral and virtuous by his supporters. On the opposite side, they considered him a devil. So even morality and virtue is contested. In terms of theory, my tendency is not to look so much at democratization or modernization, but to look at the conflicts that underpin the social and economic forces in society and try to identify the material bases. Now I've given it away. Identify the material bases of those conflicts. So in one sense, that's why in recent work I've been concentrating on inequality and voting patterns. It's not a very looking at voting patterns and trying to relate it to socioeconomic status, etc., is not an easy thing to do. The data isn't always that great, but that's the sort of area that I've been looking at and trying to understand why Thaksin had so much support from people in the north and the northeast. One of the questions that is being asked in terms of reconciliation in Thailand does revolve around morals, and the question that's been raised is, if we can't find any moral leaders, can we at least find someone who are moral enough? So I guess there's a compromise being thought about there. Let me jump, because it's related to the last question on reconciliation. There was a significant reconciliation which took place with the end of the CPT. There was a no questions asked amnesty. Now, if you raise the term amnesty in Thailand today, everyone just goes crazy, right? It can't happen. That's what happened when they tried to have an amnesty for Thaksin. It was the same kind of amnesty in a sense. Thaksin and everyone else. No questions asked, everyone gets the amnesty. It wasn't going to happen. In the 1980s, it did happen. And this came from a military leader who had led a coup in 1978. General Kriang Sak, and then it was taken forward by General Prem, who's now the president of the Privy Council. There were no questions asked, and in fact there has been a lot of thinking about what those people who went to the jungle, who were mainly middle class, Sino-Thai middle class people from Bangkok who fled to the jungle and joined the CPT. In fact, the Octoberists, as they're called, the people who led the uprising against the military regime in 1973, and many of them then fled to the jungle, have a particular status in Thailand's politics and the discussion of politics, and they're taken very, very seriously because they are people who are seen to have made sacrifices, as it turns out in the end, for the nation. Right, so Thaksin is not necessarily seen by the other side as having made sacrifices for the nation. So reconciliation, until I get to a stage of thinking about that inclusivity, a similar kind of transition is not going to take place. To turn to policies, when you mention the local level initiatives, water buffaloes and that sort of thing, I think you might be referring to something that was called the One Tambon or Sub-District One Product campaign that Thaksin organised, which was taken from a Japanese model. And what they tried to do was to promote, actually it's local level entrepreneurialism that they're trying to promote, and it was a lot of women's groups that got involved in producing these products. And that program actually has still continued until today. And I was in Taiwan recently and walked into an O-Top shop. They've introduced that policy there. So a number of Thaksin's policies have been fairly successful, but they were policies which were mainly universalist. And one of the downfalls for his sister was that some of the policies that they introduced were not universalist. For example, they introduced a subsidy for people buying motor cars. Now that's not really universalist, right? So that's, once you move away from the universalist policies, you start to struggle politically. Becomes divisive almost. On the healthcare program, yes, it's been remarkably successful. A really successful program. As I said before, infant mortality rates are down. There were lots of criticisms of it when it was introduced. The idea is claimed to have been sent to Thaksin by fax, that's how long ago it was, as a 1.5-page document which from one of these Octoberist people who was working in the countryside who said if you want to solve problems, you need this. And Thaksin took it up and his people worked through it. One of the reasons that the program was successful is that the medical profession had become decentralised. A lot of the people who came back from the Communist Party, or I shouldn't say a lot, there were some very significant people who came back from the Communist Party who had been medical doctors or nurses or medical trainees, who then took up posts out in the countryside as directors of provincial hospitals and so on, who established hospitals with development activities as well. And that kind of process meant that when Thaksin came along with this scheme to help people throughout the country, a universal scheme, there was support within a significant part of the medical establishment. The Rural Doctors Association, as it was called, was made up of people who had come back and was headed by a royalist named Prawet Wasi, who was a famous haematologist, who won the Magsaysay Award, I think. Yeah. Sorry?
Family planning.
No, that was another one. I forget what he won it for, but he did win it at some stage, yeah. He was able to provide a kind of a support and a mechanism, and they created a network all around the country that built on these rural doctors who were all directors of provincial hospitals. Sorry, not provincial hospitals, district hospitals, the lowest hospital level. And then you had, below them, you had provincial village health stations. So that got support. And in fact, many of the people in the medical planning unit in the Ministry of Public Health had supported and been promoting a universal health care scheme for a long time. Of course, there were doctors who were opposed. The private hospitals were opposed. Doctors who were making most of their living running clinics in the evenings and on weekends, some of them were opposed to it. There were a few websites that popped up that said it was socialised medicine. What's happened in recent years, however, is that the medical profession has been taken, the Ministry of Public Health has been taken over almost entirely by people who are on the royalist side of politics. The university senates, presidents are almost all on that side of politics. There's been an effort to put people who are royalists on that into those positions. So that when the demonstrations were being held recently, the permanent secretary of the Ministry of Public Health opposed his government and supported the demonstrators. He is now effectively the Minister for Public Health. Because there's no ministers, because there's no cabinet, the permanent secretaries have all become ministers. And he said just in the last few days, he's put out feelers saying we should not get rid of this scheme, but we should introduce co-pays, not of 30 baht, but of 30 to 50% of the cost of the treatment. Now that's really not a co-pay, that's something else. But it's being done on the basis of we have to uproot the Thaksin system, and this is one way, the regime, and this is one way of doing it. This is something that ties the people to Thaksin. I think I've got it all.